West was not a place, it was a fever dream. A raw, burning hallucination stretched beneath a sun that never forgave. The horizon wasn't made of gold, as stories later claimed, but of dust, bones, and the quiet desperation of men who had lost their way trying to find fortune or justice, or redemption. Out here, justice didn't come from the law. It came from the barrel of a gun. And more often than not, it was paid in blood. By the mid-1800s, bounty hunting had become a profession for those too dangerous to fit among ordinary men, and too desperate to stay honest. The frontier didn't have enough sheriffs, and those it did have were often outnumbered 10 to 1. So the government, the railroad companies, and the banks turned to something else. They put a price on crime itself. A wanted poster became the new currency of the West. Every outlaw had a value, every corpse a payday. The men who answered that call weren't heroes. They were wanderers, drifters, ex-soldiers, gamblers, thieves, and men whose souls had been scorched clean of compassion by the desert wind. They rode into towns with wanted posters pinned to their saddlebags and revolvers that smelled of yesterday's violence. You could tell a bounty hunter the moment you saw him. His eyes were like polished glass, reflective, unreadable, hollow. He'd seen too much death to fear it anymore. The job was simple on paper: hunt a man, bring him in dead or alive. But in truth, it was a game of madness. There were no rules, no oversight, no mercy. If you mistook an innocent man for your target, you could still get paid if the poster said dead or alive. And if your quarry surrendered, you still had to make it back through miles of desert, ambushes, and towns where the dead man had brothers. The bounty wasn't just on the outlaw's head, it was on yours, too. The moment you took the job, imagine it: the dry heat blistering your lips, the metallic taste of sweat and gun oil in your mouth, the sound of your horse's hooves echoing across empty plains. You follow a trail of blood and boot prints for days, sleeping with your revolver clutched against your chest. You eat jerky that tastes of dust, drink water that smells like rust. Every shadow is a threat, every silence a trap. You're chasing ghosts, and half the time, they're chasing you back in the saloons. Bounty hunters were both feared and despised. They walked in like ghosts, faces hidden beneath the wide brim of a hat, spurs clinking softly against wooden floors. The room would go quiet, not out of respect, but out of unease. Nobody trusted a man who killed for money, even if he claimed it was for justice. But if you needed someone to find a missing man, avenge a robbery, or drag a murderer out of a canyon, you called him. You bought him a drink, you whispered a name, and you hoped you never saw his eyes again. The pay was brutal math. A petty thief might earn you $25. A murderer could bring $100, or more if you lived long enough to collect it. The posters were drawn by hand, faces roughly sketched, names misspelled. Sometimes, bounty hunters killed the wrong man and didn't care. The sheriff would shrug, count the coins, and stamp collected across the parchment. Justice wasn't a principle, it was an exchange. And yet, beneath the greed and the grit, there was a strange kind of poetry in their madness. Every bounty hunter believed, in his own broken way, that he was bringing order to chaos. He convinced himself that every bullet he fired was one less villain on the trail, one less murderer roaming free. But deep down, he knew the truth. The line between outlaw and hunter was a thread thinner than smoke. Many hunters started as criminals themselves. Many outlaws had once worn badges. The West devoured men's identities. It didn't matter what side you began on. Sooner or later, you were both. There were legends among them. Tom Horn, who claimed to bring in more than 50 men, though most were shot before sunrise. Pat Garrett, who became famous for gunning down Billy the Kid, only to die the same way years later. Some rode with posses, others worked alone, sleeping under the stars with their rifles as their only companions. Their horses often knew the trail better than they did. They rode into ghost towns where the only law was a wanted poster nailed to a splintered post. Sometimes it wasn't even about the bounty. Sometimes it was personal. A hunter would hear a name a man who'd killed his brother, stolen his horse, burned his homeland. That poster became more than a paycheck. It became a blood debt. He tracked that man across rivers, through mountain passes, through snow and sun and madness, until one of them finally stopped breathing. Out there, the line between vengeance and justice blurred until it disappeared. But make no mistake, the life of a bounty hunter was not a glamorous one. Most died young. Some vanished in the desert, their bones later mistaken for the men they were chasing. Others grew old but broken, haunted by the faces of the people they'd killed. The West was not a land that forgave. It was a land that remembered. Every grave had a story, and every bounty hunter had more than he could tell. That at night, by the fire, they'd drink cheap whiskey and talk in low voices about ghosts, how some men didn't stay dead, how others had looked them in the eye before the final shot and whispered their curses. You could see the weight of those memories in there. Hands that trembled even when the guns didn't. The desert had a way of hollowing a man out until only his instincts remained. That the real madness wasn't in the gunfights or the chases, it was in the waiting. Days of silence, weeks without finding a trail, endless moments where your mind began to turn against you. Paranoia became a companion. You'd wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of wind through the canyons, thinking it was footsteps. You'd shoot shadows just to quiet your fear. And when you finally did find your target, when the bullet left the chamber and the echo rolled across the plains, you didn't feel victory. You felt emptiness, because every man you killed took something from you, something you could never buy back with the gold you earned. That was the true price of bounty hunting in the Wild West. Not the danger, not the loneliness, not even the blood. It was the slow erosion of what made you human. You began as a man chasing criminals and ended as a ghost chasing shadows. The bounty system was a reflection of the West itself, chaotic, merciless, and driven by greed disguised as justice. It turned desperate men into predators and gave them permission to call it righteousness. Every wanted poster was a story of hunger, somebody's hunger for money, for vengeance, or for meaning. And in a land where the law traveled slower than a horse, madness became the only kind of order people could count on. So when we speak of bounty hunters today, we remember their guns, their grit, their cold steel resolve. But what we should remember is this: they were not heroes. They were survivors of a world gone wild. Men who traded their souls for silver and sanity for survival. And as the sun burned down on the endless plains of the frontier, one truth echoed louder than all the gunfire. Out here, the law wasn't written in ink. It was written in blood. It always started with a poster, a cheap, yellowed sheet nailed to a saloon door, flapping in the wind like a whisper of violence. Wanted, dead or alive. Beneath it, a name, a reward, and a hand-drawn face that barely resembled a man. Sometimes it was a thief, sometimes a killer, sometimes just a drifter who crossed the wrong person. But that piece of paper had the power to turn one man into prey and another into a hunter. It was the closest thing the Wild West had to divine judgment, and it was bought with silver coins. And spilled blood. The price on a man's head could tell you everything about the world he lived in. $20 meant you'd stolen a horse. 50 meant you'd robbed a stagecoach. 100 or more meant you'd killed somebody important, someone whose death the town actually cared about. Justice had a market value, and that market thrived on desperation. You see, bounty hunting wasn't born out of order, it was born out of chaos. When lawmen were too few and the wilderness too vast, bounty posters became the long arm of a system that couldn't reach beyond its borders. But in truth, they created something darker, a twisted economy of death. The West was full of men who'd sell their own brother for $50, and others who'd risk everything just to prove they could. It wasn't law that kept people in line, it was fear of being next. To chase a man across the plains wasn't just a job, it was an obsession. Once a hunter saw the reward written in black ink, he'd dream about it. He'd imagine what he'd buy with the money: a cabin by the river, a new horse, a quiet life away from the gunfire. But the bounty was never just money, it was a promise of control in a world that had none. And for men who'd lost everything to war, poverty, or whiskey, that promise was intoxicating. But the system was a cruel joke. Most bounties never paid what they promised. You might risk your life for $100, only to lose half the processing fees, taxes, and the sheriff's cut. Sometimes the man who posted the bounty skipped town before you brought the target in. Other times, you drag your prize hundreds of miles to find out another hunter got there first. And even when you did collect, the gold never lasted. You spent it on bullets, whiskey, and new boots to chase the next ghost. The bounty hunter lived in a cycle of pursuit and decay, forever chasing something he could never keep. But beneath that surface of greed, there was something more insidious, a kind of moral erosion that happened slowly, like rust on iron. At first, it was just survival. Then it became sport. Some hunters began to enjoy the chase more than the capture. The danger, the adrenaline, the thrill of being the predator, it gave them a sense of purpose nothing else could. And when you live long enough in that kind of madness, killing starts to feel like routine. The Wild West was full of blurred lines. Sometimes the hunter was more dangerous than the hunted. A few bounty men were killers who'd reinvented themselves, using the law as a mask. They'd hunt down their enemies, call it justice, and collect a paycheck for murder. Towns didn't ask too many questions. The wanted man was dead, that was good enough. In a world where life was cheap and graves were shallow, moral clarity was a luxury nobody could afford. Outlaws, too, understood the system. They'd read their own posters, laugh about the numbers, and sometimes even collect bounties on rivals themselves. It wasn't uncommon for a bounty hunter to become an outlaw and then be hunted by another man just like him. The frontier didn't care about labels. It was a revolving door of killers wearing different hats. And then there was the spectacle of it all. When a bounty hunter dragged a man into town, dead or barely breathing, people gathered to watch. It was entertainment in a world without theater. Children peered from windows. Old men spat tobacco and placed bets on whether the outlaw would hang or rout. The hunter would stand silent, dust covered, his shadow stretching long in the evening sun, while the sheriff counted the reward in coins that clinked like judgment. For a brief moment, he was the hero of the story. And then, when the next poster went up, he became a ghost again. But the real tragedy wasn't in the violence, it was in what the system did to the soul. When you put a price on human life, you begin to forget its value. Every kill made the next one easier. Every reward felt lighter. The faces of the dead became part of a collection, remembered not for who they were, but for how much they were worth. Some bounty hunters kept journals, lists of names and amounts, written like grocery tallies. 20 for Jed Walker, 50 for Sam Redding, 100 for Black Tooth McGraw. A life reduced to numbers on the page. And sometimes, when the desert went quiet and the stars came out, those names whispered back. There are stories of hunters who woke in the night, certain they'd seen the faces of their dead in the coals of their campfires. Others swore they heard voices calling them by name when the wind swept through the canyon. Maybe it was guilt, maybe it was the desert playing tricks, or maybe it was the price they paid for putting gold where mercy should have been dot in the end. The madness of bounty hunting wasn't just the killing, it was the illusion that it meant something. They told themselves they were bringing justice, but justice without conscience is just revenge in disguise. And yet, in a land as savage as the frontier, that illusion was all they had. It kept them sane nor close enough to it, because to admit that they were just paid killers would mean facing the emptiness they carried inside that and that emptiness was vast. It stretched wider than the desert, deeper than any canyon, heavier than a saddle full of coins. Every man they hunted was a reflection of themselves, a reminder of what they'd become to survive. They couldn't stop, because stopping meant feeling. And in the Wild West, feeling was the fastest way to die, so they rode on. From one town to the next, one ghost to another, dust on their boots, blood on their hands, a poster in their pocket, and a promise in their mind that the next job would be the last. But it never was, because the bounty system didn't just hunt men, it hunted souls. And in the end, no matter how many rewards they collected, the West always collected its own price. When the morning sun rose over the endless plains, you could see them riders in the distance, silhouettes against the fire-colored sky, each one chasing the shadow, each one haunted by the same truth, that in a world built on greed and blood, justice was just another illusion painted on paper. And if you look close enough at those wanted posters, you'd realize the truth the hunters never saw. The face staring back at them was their own. The West had a cruel sense of irony. Out there, the line between hunter and hunted was no thicker than a trigger pull. You could wake up one morning with a bounty poster in your saddlebag, and by sundown, find your own face nailed to a saloon door. In a land where loyalty was worth less than a whiskey shot, betrayal wasn't just common, it was currency. A bounty hunter lived by the same creed as the men he pursued. Trust no one, sleep lightly, and shoot first if your gut told you to. The desert didn't reward kindness, it punished hesitation. You might ride alongside a man for months, sharing food, bullets, and secrets, only for him to sell you out when your name appeared on the poster worth more than his conscience. It didn't matter how many miles you rode, or how many men you brought down sooner or later. Every hunter became prey. That it always started with whispers. Maybe you killed the wrong man, a brother to an outlaw with a long memory. Maybe you took a bounty someone else had been tracking for weeks. Maybe you were just too good at your job. The West didn't like men who lived too long. It had a way of balancing the scales. A single rumor could follow you across 3 states, and by the time you heard it, half the saloons from Texas to Montana would already be watching the door when you walked in. The hunters who lasted weren't the fastest guns, they were the most paranoid. They slept with their backs to canyon walls, horses tied close, and pistols under their hats. They memorized every sound of the night, the coyotes, the crickets, the wind moving through sagebrush, so that when something didn't sound right, they'd know. Out here, even silence could kill you. Betrayal wore many faces. Sometimes it was the law itself. You'd bring in a man, bloodied and broken, hand him to the sheriff, and when you came back for your reward, nothing. The sheriff would shrug, claim the bounty had been rescinded, and have you thrown in a cell until the paperwork cleared. Sometimes you'd rot there for weeks. Sometimes the sheriff's cousin would take your horse, your guns, and your name and ride off collecting bounties under it. There was no appeal, no protection, no justice. The West didn't care who was right, it cared who had the gun. But the worst betrayal came from within. The longer a man hunted, the more he changed. The thrill of the chase became a hunger, and hunger always grows. At first, you hunted for money, then for justice, then for reputation. But eventually, you hunted because you didn't know what else to do. The job was all that kept you moving. The silence between hunts was unbearable, filled with the ghosts of men you'd killed. And so you'd go back out again, not to live, but to forget. That was the madness of the frontier. The desert wasn't just a place, it was a mirror. It reflected back every sin, every selfish thought, every drop of blood you'd spilled. And when you stared long enough into that emptiness, you began to see yourself in the men you hunted. You realized you weren't chasing villains, you were chasing versions of yourself. And when that truth hit you, it didn't free you, it broke you. Some hunters couldn't handle it. They'd drink themselves blind, pick fights in saloons, or ride into ambushes they saw coming. Others turned outlaw themselves, easier to run from the law than from their own reflection. The wanted posters became a hall of mirrors. The same faces kept reappearing, only the names changed. It was a cycle that fed on itself. Hunter kills outlaw. Hunter becomes outlaw. Another hunter kills him. And so it went until the desert swallowed them all. There was one story, half myth, half memory, about a hunter named Elias Crane. He was said to have collected over 70 bounties, never missing a mark. Cold, quiet, and efficient. But the story goes that one day, while tracking an outlaw named Clay Burrows, Elias stopped dead in the desert. The man he was chasing had the same eyes as him, not figuratively, literally. Same scar, same gait, same birthmark under his jaw. The bounty poster had his own face on it that no one knows who drew it or why. Some say the sheriff put his name there after a killing gone wrong. Others said the law had grown tired of men like him and decided to make an example. Elias rode back into town and pinned the poster to the saloon wall himself. "Seems I finally found the man I've been hunting," he said, before walking back into the desert. He was never seen again. Some say he shot himself. Others say he's still out there, wandering between the dunes, chasing his own ghost. Whether true or not, stories like that carried weight. They were warnings whispered by campfire light, because the West had no mercy for men who thought themselves untouchable. You could escape bullets, but you couldn't escape memory. And memory, out there, was the cruelest hunter of all. The bounty system didn't just breed killers, it bred paranoia. Townsfolk looked at strangers with suspicion. Every drifter could be a wanted man. Every handshake could hide a pistol. The lines blurred so much that the only thing separating a hero from a criminal was who told the story first. And stories were cheap. A barkeep could sell your name for $10 to a man who wanted to make 50. That's all it took, one conversation, one loose word, and suddenly there was a price on your head. The West didn't deal in trust, it dealt in transactions. And when you lived in a world where everything had a price, even loyalty, you learned to sleep with one eye open. There's a saying that survived the era: you can't kill a man who's already dead inside. That was the secret of the bounty hunter's endurance. The only way to outlive the madness was to stop feeling it. Still, even the hardest men cracked. They'd wake in the night screaming at ghosts only they could see. Some wrote letters to no one, confessing sins no one asked about. Others tried to find God again, but the churches were too far between, and the preachers had long since lost their own faith. The desert was the only sermon left, and it preached one truth: out here, you don't live long enough to repent that eventually. Every bounty hunter met the same fate. Some died in gunfights. Some were betrayed by partners. Some just disappeared into the vast silence of the plains, their bones bleaching under the sun until the wind forgot their names. But their legacy lingered in the stories told by travelers, in the myths that grew larger than truth. The hunter who became the hunted became more than a man. He became a symbol, a warning, a lesson carved into the bones of the frontier. Because in the end, that was the West's greatest cruelty. It didn't need to kill you to bury you. It just waited until your fear, your guilt, your hunger consumed you, until you became another ghost haunting the desert wind. So when we talk about the madness of bounty hunting, we're not talking about bullets or blood. We're talking about the slow unraveling of a man's mind when he realizes the thing he's been chasing all his life was never out there, it was always inside him. And when he finally understands that, that's when the real hunt begins. The Wild West was not a place, it was a fever dream, stitched together from desperation, greed, and the illusion of justice. By the time the frontier began to settle, the bounty hunters, who had once been seen as rough-edged heroes, had become something else entirely. They were men and sometimes women who had spent a long chasing ghosts across the plains, and the line between hunter and hunted had started to dissolve into the dust. Imagine you're one of them, your name long forgotten, but your legend whispered across taverns. You've killed more men than you can count, though you stopped counting years ago. At first, it was about survival. Then it became about money. And finally, it became about something darker. Something you couldn't name that as the West aged. So did its bounty hunters? The young guns who once rode for the thrill of the chase grew older, more haunted. The faces on the wanted posters began to blur together, bandits, deserters, petty thieves, all reduced to numbers and rewards. Each kill earned a bit more whiskey, a bit more distance from the man they used to be. In the beginning, bounty hunting was seen as necessary. Civilization was spreading, towns were growing, and law enforcement was thin. These men filled the gaps between sheriffs and judges, bringing order where there was none. But with every bounty collected, something essential was lost. Every trigger pulled didn't just end a life, it chipped away at the soul of the hunter. They say the desert plays tricks on your mind. Spend long enough under that scorching sun, and your thoughts start to bend. The silence gets to you first, then the wind, whispering through the canyons like the ghosts of the men you've killed. You start to see faces in the sand, hear footsteps behind you when there's no one there. Many bounty hunters began to lose themselves in that silence. Some drank themselves into oblivion. Others kept writing, hunting anyone who even vaguely resembled the face on the wanted poster. The madness wasn't sudden, it crept in slowly, like rot beneath the surface. One of the most infamous bounty hunters of the late 1800s was Thomas Grave I. Maddox. His story was whispered across the frontier as a cautionary tale of what the hunt could do to a man. Maddox started as a lawman, a deputy with a sense of duty, but when his family was killed by outlaws, something inside him snapped. He traded his badge for a rifle and became one of the most feared bounty hunters in the West. For years, Maddox hunted without rest. It didn't matter if his bounties were dead or alive, he always brought them back one way, cold. Some said he stopped sleeping. Others claimed he talked to the corpses of the men he killed, keeping them company by the campfire. There's an old journal found after Maddox vanished in 1889. In it, he wrote, "Each man I kill looks a bit more like me. Sometimes I think I've been chasing myself across this land, and I'm scared one day I'll catch him." That was the madness of the frontier, the kind that made you question whether the devil you were chasing lived outside you or inside your own shadow. By the 1880s, towns were beginning to settle. Railroads cut through the wilderness, and law and order began to take root. But the bounty hunters, shaped by chaos, didn't know how to live in peace. They were relics of a dying age, men out of place in a new America. Some tried to adapt. They became sheriffs, security men, or guides, but others couldn't. The quiet was unbearable, the structure suffocating. They were born in the hunt and didn't know who they were without it. You could see it in their eyes, the same haunted stare shared by soldiers after war. They had lived too long in a world where morality was measured in bullets. The laws of the civilized East didn't apply to them anymore. Out there, the only law was survival. The descent into madness wasn't just mental, it was moral. Bounty hunters began to take jobs that blurred the line between justice and murder. Ranchers hired them to deal with squatters. Politicians paid them to silence rivals. Every man had a price, and every death a justification. By the late 19th century, newspapers had begun to romanticize bounty hunters. Dime novels turned killers into legends, men like Wild Bill Hickok and Pat Garrett. But behind the tales of courage and glory, the truth was uglier. Many of those heroes died broke, alone, or drunk in nameless towns. The West had no loyalty, not even to those who helped tame it. The madness wasn't only in the bounty hunters, it was in the system itself. The frontier thrived on violence, rewarding those who could deliver it efficiently. It created killers, then called them heroes. It demanded justice, then applauded vengeance. And when it was all over, when the railroads had stretched from coast to coast, when telegraphs buzzed and cities rose from dust, the bounty hunters were left behind. Their work was done, but their souls had nowhere to rest. Some wandered into Mexico, others disappeared into the mountains. A few ended up in asylums, muttering to themselves about ghosts and gunfights that no one remembered. Their madness wasn't a sudden collapse, it was the slow unraveling of men who had seen too much, done too much, and found nothing at the end of it all. Imagine sitting by a campfire at night, the firelight flickering against your revolver. You're alone, save for your horse and the distant cry of a coyote. You think about the men you've killed, about the rewards you've earned and spent, and somewhere in that quiet, you realize the truth. The real bounty you've been chasing all along wasn't gold. It was peace, and you never collected. That's what the madness of bounty hunting was. Not the thrill of the chase, not the violence of the gunfight, but the emptiness afterward, the echo of a life that's been reduced to survival and blood. When the sun rose the next morning, men like Maddox would saddle up and ride again, because in the end, that's all they knew how to do. They weren't heroes or villains, they were ghosts caught between both worlds, cursed to keep riding long after the world had moved on. And somewhere in the distance, another wanted poster flapped in the wind, waiting for a name to be crossed out. By the time the dust of the Old West began to settle, a new kind of order started creeping, and not through courage, but through paperwork. The gunfights were fading, the saloons were quieter, and the echo of lawlessness that had once defined the frontier was slowly being buried under ledgers, telegraphs, and the hum of steam trains. Yet, in that uneasy transition between chaos and civilization, the bounty hunters, the men who had kept the balance by sheer grit and gunpowder, found themselves stranded in a world that no longer needed them. It was the late 1880s. The railroad stitched together the continent like steel veins, pumping the lifeblood of industry into towns that had once been only wooden dreams on the horizon. The telegraph wired justice faster than a horse could gallop, and a new generation of lawmen in tailored coats began replacing the old-timers, who wore dust like a second skin. The age of outlaws was dying, but so too was the wild, unrestrained freedom that made the West what it was. And as the old ways crumbled, so did the men who embodied them. Bounty hunting had once thrived in the vacuum of authority, where sheriffs couldn't reach. The bounty hunter rode. He was the middle ground between law and savagery, between order and chaos. But as cities grew and jurisdictions expanded, bounty hunting was no longer seen as a necessity. It was a nuisance, a relic, a profession to steeped in blood and ambiguity for the clean conscience of the new world. Governments began tightening control. Territories became states, and state lines meant rules, paperwork, warrants signed by real judges instead of whiskey-stained saloon owners. You couldn't just ride into a town with a corpse draped over your saddle and expect a bag of silver anymore. You needed documents, proof, authorization, and the new marshals didn't look kindly on men who shot first and justified later. Some bounty hunters tried to adapt. They traded their dusty hats for star-shaped badges, turning lawless experience into official authority. Others couldn't stomach the hypocrisy. They'd seen too much of what real justice looked like, how it was born in fear, desperation, and survival, not in the tidy words of courtrooms. The new law of the frontier wasn't written on dusty paperbacks or spoken over whiskey glasses. It was written in iron, in the shifting balance of control. The railroad barons, bankers, and industrialists who rose from the east didn't need gunfighters. They had contracts, deeds, and Pinkerton agents. And the Pinkertons were a different breed altogether. They were the polished successors of the bounty hunter corporate men with clean suits and dirtier morals. They didn't chase outlaws for personal gain. They hunted for corporations, governments, and empires. They spied, sabotaged, and sometimes silenced those who stood in the way of profit. The gunfighters' chaos was replaced by quiet corruption to the men who had lived through the chaos. This new kind of order felt alien worse. It felt dishonest. The old bounty hunter could look his enemy in the eye, settle the score under the sun, and walk away. The new world, with its hidden hands and invisible laws, didn't offer that kind of clarity. The frontier had always been cruel, but at least it had been honest in its cruelty. Imagine one of those old hunters, let's call him Elias Boone. He had ridden across the plains for 20 years, hunted men from Texas to Montana, and lived by a code that made sense in his world. You do the job, you get paid, you keep your word. But one day, Boone rides into a town that's changed. The sheriff is young, with city manners. The saloon is gone, replaced by a bank, and the wanted posters his lifeblood are gone to. Instead, the sheriff points to a typewriter on his desk and says, "We don't take those kinds anymore." Boone, the railroad company's handling their own men now. Boone doesn't understand. How do you hunt a man if the law won't even name him? How do you fight an enemy who hides behind company letters and courtrooms? This was the silent tragedy of the old bounty hunters. They weren't defeated in the gunfight, they were erased by progress. No one wrote about them in the history books. Their names faded into myth, their graves unmarked, their stories replaced by the neat, convenient legends sold to city readers in dime store novels. Yet, beneath all the progress, the spirit of the frontier never truly died. It changed its form. Every skyscraper that rose over the plains, every factory that replaced the field, carried a bit of that wildness in its bones. The drive, the ambition, the hunger that built America came from those same men who once rode into the wilderness, chasing ghosts and gold but for the bounty hunters themselves. This transformation was hollow. They had lived their whole lives on the edge of danger, believing that chaos gave life meaning. Without it, they were empty. Some tried to start anew, opening taverns, working as railroad guards, or serving as bodyguards for wealthy businessmen. But you could always tell who they were by the way they moved, slow, cautious, eyes always scanning the room. The hunt never left them. As the 20th century approached, bounty hunting became a shadow of its former self. Laws changed, rewards were regulated, killing for pay was no longer seen as brave, it was barbaric. And so the old hunters faded quietly into obscurity. But their legacy, raw, brutal, and human, never left. Even now, the myth of the bounty hunter lingers in the American imagination. The loner, the drifter, the man who lives by his own code. He appears again and again in stories, movies, and dreams. Because deep down, there's something timeless about that kind of freedom. Something terrifying and beautiful about a man who answers to no one but the desert and his conscience. That was the final lesson of the new law of the frontier. Civilization doesn't erase the wild, it only hides it under new names. The frontier didn't end when the maps were filled or the railroads completed. It simply moved inward into the hearts of men. The bounty hunter became a symbol, a ghost haunting the edges of progress. He became every man who refused to conform, every spirit too wild to be contained by systems and rules. His revolver might have gone silent, but his legend kept echoing in the American soul, a reminder that every civilization is built on the bones of the men who tamed it. In the end, the new law wasn't about justice, it was about control. And the bounty hunters, for all their sins and violence, were the last men who lived before control took hold, before the world became too civilized to remember what it once took to survive. So the next time you hear the wind whistling through the plains, imagine the ghost of a bounty hunter riding across it, coat tattered, hat pulled low, horse kicking up dust from a land that no longer remembers his name. He's not chasing anyone anymore. He's just riding because that's what he was born to do. And in that endless ride, he carries the last breath of a world that once belonged to the mad, the brave, and the free. Freedom, the word that painted the skies of the American frontier. Like the morning sun over open plains, it was the dream that pulled men westward, the mirage they chased through dust storms and deserts. But freedom in the Wild West wasn't what the poets wrote about. It wasn't clean, or romantic, or righteous. Freedom was a costly thing, bought in blood, paid for with isolation, and carried like a burden on the shoulders of those too stubborn to kneel before any man or law. The bounty hunter was perhaps the truest symbol of that kind of freedom. Not the polished freedom of cities or constitutions, but the raw, untamed kind, the kind that lived and died by its own rules. He wasn't owned by a government or beholden to a sheriff. He lived outside of both morality and order, surviving on skill, instinct, and the thin line between justice and vengeance. To most, he was an outlaw with permission. To himself, he was a free man in a world that no longer understood what that meant. But that kind of freedom had a price, and the bounty hunter paid it every day. Picture a man alone on the frontier's only companion's a horse, a rifle, and the wind that never stops whispering. He's hunted by hunger, by guilt, and by the memory of every man he's killed. He could ride into any town, but he doesn't belong in any of them. People eye him with suspicion. Children hide when he passes. They might thank him for catching a killer, but they won't break bread with him afterward. He's useful, not welcome. That's the blood price of freedom. You can go anywhere, but you belong nowhere. Every bounty he takes is a piece of that freedom traded for survival. He tells himself it's just another job, bring them in dead or alive. Take the money, move on. But with each life ended, with each soul handed over to the law, he becomes a little less free. Because no matter how far you ride, you can't outrun the ghosts that ride behind you. Some bounty hunters try to justify their work as service to justice. But what is justice in a world without order? In the West, justice wasn't a courtroom, it was a six-shooter. It was the silence after the shot, the dust that settled over a body, the sound of coins jingling in a leather pouch. And for a while, that made sense. Out there, where lawmen were few and mercy was dangerous, justice had to be quick and final. But over time, even the bounty hunters began to see the cracks in their creed. They were killing men not because they deserved it, but because someone paid them to. Freedom, they realized, had turned them into mercenaries of morality. Take the story of William Hollowjack Marin, a bounty hunter known across the territories for his precision and cold resolve. He was said to have never missed a shot or refused a contract. But in his later years, when the killing slowed and the whiskey bottles emptied faster than his coin purse, he confessed something strange to a traveling preacher. He said, "I started chasing killers because I thought it made me better than them. But somewhere along the trail, I became the man they used to be." That's what the blood price does, it blurs the lines. Every choice you make out there costs you something. To live free, you have to give up comfort. To survive, you have to sacrifice morality. And to keep your freedom, you have to become the thing everyone else fears. For some, that trade was worth it. They'd rather die free in the desert than live bound by the rules of the East. The idea of waking up under someone else's command was worse than death. Freedom, to them, wasn't just a condition, it was an identity. Even if it meant starving, killing, or dying alone. Yet, even as bounty hunters claimed to be free, they were chained in other ways. They were bound to the bounty posters that defined their worth. Bound to the gun that dictated their fate. Bound to the endless horizon that never promised rest. True freedom, as they'd come to learn, isn't just about being unchained, it's about finding peace within the chains you choose. The bounty hunter's curse was that he never found peace. His world was perpetual motion ride, hunt, kill, collect, repeat. The road never ended because he didn't want it to. Stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering. The names, the faces, the pleas, they all came back when the gun went silent. Some men drank to forget, others prayed. Some simply rode into the wilderness and never came back. The wilderness, after all, was the last place where freedom still existed in its purest form, merciless, magnificent, and unforgiving. The bounty hunter's relationship with freedom mirrored America's own, built on blood, haunted by guilt, but driven by the relentless belief that the individual must stand taller than any law. That's what made the West both beautiful and brutal. Every man wanted freedom, but no one wanted to pay its full price. When the new laws arrived, when the telegraph replaced the horse, and the railroad replaced the trail, the old hunters saw it as betrayal. Civilization came disguised as progress, but what it really meant was control. Freedom had been captured, domesticated, and sold back to the people as safety. The bounty hunters, who once defined independence, became symbols of its extinction. Yet, for all its tragedy, there was a strange nobility in their struggle. They were the last men to live by their own code, even when the world turned against them. They didn't beg for understanding or forgiveness. They knew their time was ending, but they didn't flinch. They had made their choice long ago to live and die as free men, even if it cost them everything else. There's a certain poetry in that kind of madness. To chase freedom so relentlessly that it destroys you, yet still refuse to give it up. To ride into the wilderness knowing you never come back, but doing it anyway because you can't bear to be anything else. That's not just courage, it's devotion. It's the purest form of defiance. In the end, when civilization finally covered the plains and the sound of gunfire became a memory, the bounty hunter faded into myth, but his spirit never left. You can still feel it in the wind that sweeps across the empty deserts, in the lonely whistle of a train, in the quiet rebellion that still burns in every man who refuses to be tamed. Because freedom, true freedom, isn't something you inherit. It's something you fight for. It's something you pay for. And if the bounty hunters of the Wild West taught us anything, it's that every inch of liberty has a cost. Sometimes that cost is blood. Sometimes it's your soul. That's the blood price of freedom. And for men like Hollow Jack, Elias Boone, and Thomas Maddox, it was a price they paid willingly because they knew that dying free, even in madness, was better than living chained in peace. So the next time you hear tales of the Wild West, the lawmen, the outlaws, the bounty hunters, remember that beneath the stories of gold and gunfire lies something deeper. A story about what it truly means to be free, and how sometimes the hardest thing about freedom is surviving it. When the frontier finally fell silent, when the last gunshot faded into the canyon winds and the smell of gunpowder gave way to the scent of iron and smoke from railroads, something remained behind, something invisible, something restless. The land remembered what had been done to it. The plains, the deserts, the canyons, all of it held echoes of the men who lived, fought, and died there. They became ghosts, not in the supernatural sense, but in the way memories haunt a place long after the bodies are gone. The bounty hunters were the most haunting of them all. They weren't buried in marked graves, and they didn't leave statues behind. Their names weren't carved into history books or printed on government papers. They were buried under the dust they helped spill, their stories surviving only in whispers passed around campfires or murmured over the clink of whiskey glasses. And yet, their presence could still be felt in the stillness of the West, like the low hum beneath a song, always there, even when you stopped listening. The people who came after them, the settlers, the businessmen, the lawmen, liked to believe the West had been tamed. But the truth was, it had only been silenced. The ghosts of the frontier still rode under those same wide skies, invisible but unforgotten. They were the reminders of a time when life and death were decided in the space between two heartbeats, and justice came from the barrel of a gun. It's said that every town in the West was built on a grave, and in every saloon there was a man drinking to forget. The bounty hunters were among the first and last of that breed, the ones who saw the full spectrum of what the frontier demanded. They had looked into the eyes of outlaws, seen the fear of men about to die, and lived with the question that never stopped burning. Was I any different from them? That question lingered long after the guns went silent. Some bounty hunters couldn't let go. When their work ended, they stayed on the fringes of towns, living like ghosts among the living. You could find them sitting on wooden porches at dusk, staring toward the horizon as if waiting for a bounty that would never come. Their hands still twitched for a revolver. Their eyes still scanned the streets for danger that no longer existed. They had spent so many years in motion that stillness felt like death. Others disappeared entirely. Some rode into the mountains and never came back. Some joined the very outlaws they once hunted. A few were said to have gone mad wandering the desert, talking to the wind as if it were an old friend. To them, the world that replaced the old West was too foreign, too quiet. The new order suffocated them. But not all ghosts are tragic. Some are simply eternal. The bounty hunter spirit became woven into American legend. The drifter, the loner, the man who lived by his own rules and answered to no one. The movies, the novels, the stories, they tried to capture his essence, to polish it, to make it heroic. But the real ghosts of the frontier weren't heroes. They were flawed, scarred men who did what they thought was necessary in a world that gave them no other choice. And in that harsh reality, there was something profoundly human, something raw and honest that modern civilization often forgets. The land remembers them in its silence. If you stand alone in the Mojave Desert at night, you can feel it, the weight of that history pressing against the stars. The air is dry, the world feels endless, and in the distance, you can almost hear the soft creak of saddle leather or the faint echo of hoofbeats on dirt. That's the echo of the old bounty hunters, their ghosts still riding, still searching, still chasing something they never quite found. What were they chasing, really? Justice, gold, revenge? Maybe none of those. Maybe what they were really after was meaning. Out there, in a world too vast and brutal to understand, a man needed purpose. And for bounty hunters, the chase was the purpose. It gave their pain direction, their loneliness shape. Without it, they were just men adrift in an endless desert of their own making. Some historians say the bounty hunters represent the darker side of the American dream, the price paid for the pursuit of freedom and progress. Others say they represent resilience, men who refuse to be broken, no matter how harsh the world became. But the truth lies somewhere in between. They were both destroyers and dreamers, protectors and predators. They were men molded by the land they walked on, hardened by it, consumed by it. There's an old legend that says the ghosts of bounty hunters still ride at night, when the moon is thin and the desert winds are high. Travelers have claimed to see shadows moving across the ridges, riders without faces, heading toward nowhere, their saddlebags heavy with unseen burdens. Some say they're still chasing bounties that were never caught. Others say they're trying to find redemption for the lives they took. But maybe they're just writing because they don't know how to stop. Because stopping means facing everything they ran from: the guilt, the loneliness, the truth that their freedom came at the cost of their souls. And so they ride, not to escape death, but to delay the reckoning they know will come when they finally dismount. The old West was full of men like that, men who couldn't let go, who became part of the land even after they died. Their bones turned to dust, but their legends became soil, feeding the myth that America still grows from today. Every cowboy movie, every story about justice and revenge. Every tale of one man standing against the world is all just a shadow of those real men. Those ghosts of the frontier who refuse to die quietly. But perhaps the most haunting thing about them isn't that they died, it's that they lived in a way we no longer can. They lived without safety nets, without guarantees, without anyone to blame but themselves. Their world was cruel, but it was honest. Every sunrise was a gift, every gunfight a gamble, every decision final. There was no bureaucracy to hide behind, no excuses to make. Just man, nature, and consequence that in that way. Maybe the ghosts of the frontier are trying to remind us of something. That freedom isn't comfortable. That justice isn't clean. That courage isn't about perfection, but persistence. They're not warning us, they're whispering a truth that civilization tries to forget. Peace is fragile, and every comfort was once paid for by someone else's suffering. So when the sun sets over the desert and the sky burns orange and red, imagine the silhouettes of those riders appearing on the horizon, not as villains, not as heroes, but as echoes of a time when men carved their own destinies in the dirt. They were flawed, yes, but they were real. And maybe, in remembering them, we keep a piece of that wildness alive within us. Because no matter how far we progress, no matter how civilized we become, there will always be a part of us that belongs to the dust, to that lonely stretch of land, where the ghosts of the frontier still ride beneath an endless sky, chasing something only they can see. As the 19th century staggered toward its twilight, the Wild West, that vast theater of dust, blood, and broken dreams, began to fade into myth. The bounty hunters, gunfighters, and restless drifters who once ruled its endless plains found themselves out of place in a world that was rapidly modernizing. The railroads had stitched the land together, telegraph lines hummed across deserts, and towns that once trembled under the weight of lawlessness now had sheriffs with polished boots and mayors with pocket watches. The West was becoming civilized, and the men who had thrived on its chaos were being left behind, relics of a violent chapter that the nation wanted to close, but never truly could. For the bounty hunter, the end came not with a gunshot, but with a slow suffocation, the kind born from progress. There were fewer posters nailed to wooden walls, fewer faces offering a price for capture, dead or alive. Outlaws either vanished into anonymity or met their fate under the gavel of a judge instead of the barrel of a revolver. The bounty hunters, once seen as grim heroes or necessary evils, became wanderers without purpose. Some took to ranching or rail work. Others drank their fortunes away in saloons that were closing faster than they could open. Yet even as the frontier quieted, echoes of that violent profession lingered like ghostly whispers in the canyons. The old bounty men, scarred, leathery, and half blind from dust and whiskey, would sit on porches, telling stories that sounded more like tall tales than truth. They spoke of men like Jesse James, Billy the Kid, and Butch Cassidy, outlaws who had danced with death and dared the law to catch them. They spoke, too, of long rides through burning deserts, of campfires lit by starlight, and of comrades who never made it home. Their voices carried pride, but also regret, for beneath the legends and blood-soaked glory, there had been loneliness, and a longing for peace that none of them could find while the hunt still consumed them. The West had been a crucible. It forged steel in some men and broke others entirely. By the 1890s, the bounty hunter was no longer a symbol of frontier justice, but a reminder of the country's turbulent adolescence. Newspapers began to romanticize their exploits, turning brutality into heroism, chaos into myth. The American people, now comfortably sitting in parlors with electricity and telephones, began to crave stories of the good old days, where life was wild and men were free. The bounty hunter, once a shadow figure, became part of folklore, a man between law and sin, chasing ghosts for a handful of dollars. But the reality was never so clean. Those who had lived it remembered the smell of gunpowder and horse sweat, the way silence felt heavier after a kill. They remembered faces, not names, the twitch of fear in the man's eyes, the sound of a body hitting the ground, the endless guilt that no bounty could wash away. Many of them carried the weight of those memories to their graves. Others turned to preaching, trying to make sense of a life that had offered no mercy. When the 20th century dawned, it brought machines that could travel faster than horses and laws that left no room for freelance justice. But in the small, forgotten corners of the West, ghost towns swallowed by sand and time, you could still find relics of that era. A wanted poster curling on the saloon wall, a rusted rifle leaning against a fence post, a leather duster hanging by the door. The bounty hunters were gone, but their ghosts remained, and perhaps that's what the Wild West always wanted, not to be remembered as it truly was, but as it felt, a place where men could test their courage, where freedom came with a price, and where justice was always one gunshot away. The bounty hunters were never saints, but they were witnesses to a land both cruel and magnificent that in the end, their madness wasn't in the chase, but in believing that they could outrun the inevitable, that a world of dust and lawlessness could last forever. But time, as it always does, claimed them too. The frontier was tamed, the trails were fenced, and the age of bounty hunters slipped quietly into legend that yet, even now, when the wind sweeps across the open plains of the American West, it carries with it the faint echoes of hoofbeats, the sound of men who once rode under blazing suns and freezing moons, chasing shadows in the lawless land, men who lived and died for gold, justice, and survival, and in doing so, became part of the story that built a nation. The madness of Wild West bounty hunting didn't die with the last outlaw. It simply changed shape, turning into the restless spirit of those who refuse to be forgotten. The cowboy, the hunter, the drifter, all still live on in the American imagination, because deep down, we're still haunted by the question they embodied. What would you do when the world gives you nothing but dust, danger, and a gun? That's what the old bounty hunters understood. The West wasn't just a place. It was a test of the soul, and those who rode its trails, no matter how lost or mad they became, helped carve a truth that still echoes today. Freedom always has a cost, and the men who chased it hardest were the ones who paid it most dearly.